Welcome, thank you for joining us. For those who don't know Data Orchard, we are a social enterprise that specialises in helping organisations get better with data. And we work entirely in the not-for-profit sector and have been researching data maturity since 2015. And a critical point in that journey was 2019, when we launched our first online tool for enabling organisations to measure their data maturity. And it's really a tool that enables organisations to self-assess how they're doing with data, see how they compare with others, and identify where to focus in order to improve. Now, there are a few, I'm really excited about the results, but there are some important things I should start off with. I am delighted that our tool's been used now by thousands of people from many hundreds of organisations. And some of the things that are really important for me to just set out at the start are some definitions. So what we mean by data maturity is an organisation's journey towards improvement and increased capability using data. When we're talking about data, we're talking really holistically. We're talking all of it, you know, not just the numbers and the numeric data, but words and images and videos and maps, and all of it in all of its messy complexity in every department, service, job, all over our organisations. And when we're talking about the non-profits, not-for-profit sector, we're essentially meaning non-commercial organisations, and the definition we use here is non-governmental organisations, public sector, universities. So it's quite a broad thing. I could spend a whole session, I'm sure Ben could as well, on how one defines the different legal types and structures of the non-profit sector. So because data is so complex and everywhere in every organisation, one of the key things we have done is to break it down into a really simple framework. This is our data maturity framework, and it's really trying to help give structure to how people think about data. And it also is aimed at kind of trying to make data more accessible and understandable to everyone in an organisation, not just the techie people. As you can see, there are 5 stages that we've identified in the data maturity journey, moving from unaware, emerging, learning, developing through to mastering. And we've identified 7 key factors that influence that progress, and they are uses and analysis, which are very much about the purposes for which the organisation is using data. There's data and tools in there that are very practical aspects of data, and a lot of it is about people. So the culture and the leadership and the skills are very much about people. Now, the data maturity assessment basically is an online questionnaire that delves into those 7 data maturity areas in more detail. And so, for example, in culture, it's exploring 4 sub-areas. It's looking at the team approach, self-questioning, the openness of data, and also the protection and security side of it as well. And it works really that a person spends about 20 minutes completing an assessment. They do quite a lot of learning as they go. And at the end of that, they get a report on how they scored. And by answering the questions, it gets them thinking and generating ideas about how to improve, and leads to action to make that happen. Now, really, the whole thing is designed for whole organisations. So, because when you scale up that perception of where the organisation is and engage lots of people, sometimes whole organisations, every member of staff completes an assessment. But the more people you ask, the more diverse the perspectives that you capture, and really the more accurate the overall result is about the organisation. So the way it works with the multiple respondent version is that lots of people fill in the assessment. They get their own reports on how they personally scored the organisation, but all of their results get combined into one overall organisation report, with the idea that multiple people in the organisations get to start talking, and then you've got collective action to improve. So the kind of report an organisation will get will look something like this. So It'll have their own logo on it, obviously, but this report is telling us that this organisation overall scored in the developing stage, and that they had 133 people in their organisation who completed it. They've got an overall score of 3.2 out of 5. It's highlighted the areas where the organisation is stronger. So this organisation is strongest in users and data and culture. And it's a little bit on the weak side around analysis, tools and skills. And then you can drill into all of those areas and look in more detail about how the organisation scored compared to benchmarks. And it will describe a bit more of where the organisation's at and where it's going. So I think that's enough about the tool, because I want to talk about the data. So how many people have taken the data maturity assessment? I should say that the data we're looking at and reporting on is for last year. So from any respondents that we had completing the assessment between the 1st of January and the 31st of December 2021. So we had over 1,000 respondents from 369 organisations. But then we have to go through a bit of a cleaning process, because we want to ensure that we're really confident that the responses we're looking at are genuinely for a non-profit organisation. So there's a bit of cleaning and categorising. So that left us with 1,007 respondents and 220 organisations. Then we had to exclude the commercial organisations. So actually quite a lot of users actually do come from the commercial sector. So excluding those, it gave us a data set of 937 respondents. And then we had to remove the respondents who'd completed our taster. So we've got a little mini cut down version, which we don't include in our more thorough responses. So in total, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a set of data that comes from 885 people from 141 non-profits who have completed the assessment. As I mentioned before about this multiple people thing, where we've had multiple respondents, all of those responses are combined to give an overall calculation for the whole organisation. And where we've only had one respondent for an organisation, we take that to be the organisation response. So that's a little bit of the detail about the data. It's very complicated, but I hope I've made it clear that what we're talking about here. So what kind of organisations? We are pleased to say that mostly, the highlighted here in the chart on the left, the responses have come from NGOs, non-governmental organisations, for whom actually the tool was originally created. We've also had quite a lot of use from the public sector, local, national level, and we've also had quite a lot of international interest. So organisations from more than 30 different countries have used the tool as well. And in terms of the types of category areas, it's really diverse, which we know already about the sector. And as you can see, the biggest areas that organisations are working in tend to be health and social services, quite a lot of local government, quite a lot of education, and a real mix across the board. I get asked a lot about the size of organisations. They're quite varied in terms of income level and by number of employees. What you'll notice from this chart is the number of don't knows. So there's quite a lot of organisations for whom we're not able to capture or find that data anywhere. When it comes to the kinds of people who are using it, there's a real diversity. The biggest users tend to be people working in strategy and planning and leadership and management areas. Unsurprisingly, there are lots of data management and analysis kind of role people using it. Interestingly, I would say a lot of people who are involved in service delivery to clients and beneficiaries are also among the bigger job role types. And I think it's worth mentioning that in many small organisations, those kinds of job roles are quite mixed up. You know, everybody has 10 jobs and 10 hats that they wear. So that was why we were kind of curious to see how the pattern looked overall. Anyway, I think that is enough background, because I'm sure all of you are more interested in the actual insights. So we have found 7 key insights that I'd like to talk us through today. The first one is the sector is still learning. You'll notice that so in this chart here, it's describing the range of data maturity across the sector. You can see that the average is 2.8 out of 5, which puts the sector as a whole in the learning stage. We have no organisations that scored unaware, and to some extent that's not really very surprising because users are self-selecting. So I guess organisations that really don't have an interest in data are very unlikely to complete a data maturity assessment. Around 1 in 10 are at the emerging stage, half are at the learning stage. A lot have progressed into the developing, so around 37% are in that developing stage. And a couple are just squeezing into that mastering stage as well. So that shows there's a real range across the not-for-profit sector. And I'm just going to add, just because people ask me about this a lot, is it different for different sectors? And the answer is no, not really, not from the data that we have. Everyone is learning, all of those sectors, subsectors are in the learning stage. So that's the sort of comparison. I think everyone's learning. But there is a lot of variation, and I think that's also important to point out. So this chart is a dot plot where we've taken the overall score. The overall score is actually a combination of their scores for each of the themes. And so in this chart, each organisation's score for each theme is plotted on here. So what you can see overall is there's, for all 7 areas, there's a real diversity of scores for organisations. And in fact, you do get quite a lot here between 0 and 1, which is the unaware stage. So even if the organisation as a whole hasn't scored in that stage, when you break it down in some areas, some organisations are. And you'll also see the median overall, which is this red dotted line, which we talked about earlier, the 2.8. as the general picture, but again there are slight differences between each of the themes. So you can see skills is the weakest theme, analysis and uses is slightly below the average as well. So a lot of leaders and a lot of laggers in every sector and in every area. So we really wanted to compare the results this year for this batch of data with the previous batch of data that we had looked at in 2020. And excitingly, it validates the findings, and there's very little difference overall, which indicates that we can feel more confident about how authoritative this data is, having repeated the exercise. But I have to be honest, at this point, when I was doing the analysis, I did wonder what I could possibly say that would be new and different and interesting, given that there was so much similarity between this year and last. And I'm pleased to say that we took the opportunity to go and do some deeper analysis and explore some of our curiosities and questions about the data. So that brings me on to the second key finding, which is the lack of skills in the sector. I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of talk about skills and the lack of skills. Actually, it's been talked about for a decade, actually. And very few organisations are really confident that they have the right skills and capabilities to maximise the use of data. Barely 1.5% are really feeling like they're on it. And there's a few that somewhat agree, but there's quite a lot of organisations that really don't feel that they've got the right skills to maximise use. When we explore issues like capacity, only 23% think that they've got the right numbers of people managing and developing their capabilities. 19% agree that most staff are data literate, and barely a quarter agree that they have access to external data and analytic support from people they trust. And I think one of the most interesting findings for me is that only 38% said that they even understood their needs around data skills and capabilities. And I think that in itself is one of our challenges, because the range of skills required in data is quite vast. I'm going to just show you the ODI, Open Data Institute's skills framework. Please don't be alarmed by this or even feel that you have to look at it in enormous detail, but I do recommend taking a look afterwards. We do a lot of research around data skills and helping organizations to assess their data skills. And it's really, it's a really broad area. And I think what's interesting about it is that this isn't about, what it tells us is that it's not about individual people, superheroes coming in and solving the organization. It's about a range of skills that may be available in a collection of people. So it is a collective effort in an organization. And in the context of a sector which very often, certainly for many of the smaller organizations, may have little or no dedicated data roles, then how those responsibilities and roles get distributed amongst the team is an interesting aspect to map. Our third key finding is about leaders, and what we're finding is that leaders, generally there's a real sense that organizations say they prioritize data and they think it's important. In fact, over half of the respondents say that data is a major organizational priority, and I know that chimes with some of the findings in other research around digital as well. But less than a third are telling us that they have data analytics expertise within their leadership. And for leaders, I think there's some real challenges. Like in here, this is people's perceptions of how they see the leadership in their organizations. And you can see really only a tiny proportion, less than 6%, really see that their leadership understands how to use data to improve, and really drives the questions and are influenced by the data. And then more commonly, leaders are seen as knowing it's important. They're kind of curiously and occasionally ask about it, but they're really not convinced about the value that it's bringing for their organization. So it is a real challenge for organizations to convince leaders, or perhaps for us as data professionals, to look at how leaders shift to that really advanced position where they're really using it as a resource for their organization. The fourth key finding is related to culture. This is actually, this question here that I'm displaying the responses to is one of many really interesting results in the culture theme. So this question was asking about how in the organization we're comfortable with using data to ask difficult questions and challenge our practices. And you can see there's a real diversity of opinion here. About a third tend to agree with that, but a lot more tend to disagree with that. And I think that's an interesting indicator of actually what we've discovered to be one of the key findings of this research. Now, please stay. Just say, some of my colleagues think this chart is actually going to make people leave the webinar, but hold on, I'm going to talk you through it. This chart is all about correlations, and correlation is measured on a scale of -1 to +1. And what it does is it measures the strength of the relationship between two variables. So you can see on the left-hand side of this chart on the y-axis, every pair of our 7 data maturity themes has been measured for the strength of the relationship. Now, relationships can be positive or negative. So if the relationship is positive, then those two things increase or decrease together. And if it was a negative relationship, then as one increased, the other would decrease. So an example of that would be rain is negatively correlated to bicycle traffic, because the more it rains, the less people are going to be on their bikes. So what we can see here is the good news is all of our key theme areas are correlated positively. So that concurs with our previous research that says it is that combination of 7 areas that combine to advance data maturity. Just focusing in on the chart, the length of these plots describes the range of scores for correlations for each organisation in the data set. And essentially, if you were to divide those scores up into a chunk of 4, then the middle half are in the box, and about a quarter are in each of the tails. So what does this chart tell us? Well, first of all, I should say that we have focused in on culture. So any of these pairings that involve culture, we've highlighted in green. And what it shows us is the top 3 most significant relationships are between culture and leadership, between culture and data, and between culture and skills. And meanwhile, what's also interesting is tools. So anything that has got tools in it, we've highlighted in this dark grey. And you can see actually the tools are the least correlated of all of these relationships. So I think what's interesting about correlations is it's great because it tells us there's a relationship, but actually it doesn't explain why. And as a reminder, culture is broadly about 4 things in our assessment. It's about openness, it's about protection, it's about team approach, and about self-questioning. So I'm really keen to hear from you. Do throw your thoughts into the chat on why is that. We continue to explore and be curious about this ourselves. Now, number 5. This is a finding that I'm probably most excited about because last year, one of our key findings was how much time is spent on data. And typically it was between 40 and 50% of all staff time. And we were really astonished by this. And since then, we've gone on to do lots and lots of data maturity assessments with lots of organisations. And fairly consistently, we do find that people are telling us, not people in data roles, people in every role in the organisation are telling us that between 40 and 50% of their time is spent working with data. Now, there's the sort of rumour that's sort of widespread about data that kind of implies that if you get really good with data, then data will take less time. Because thanks to the wizardry and magic of new technological breakthroughs, you'd spend less time because everything would be really efficient, lots of things would be automated. And so we could all really, you know, go very part-time and have a very fulfilled life because the data is going to take care of itself. So we wanted to look a little bit more closely at this, and in particular to see whether this was true, that as organisations advanced, they spent, if not less, then at least the same amount of time, but ideally they'd spend less time. So we looked into this in a little bit more detail, and this is what we found. So I should start by saying we ignored the unaware stage because we had no data, and we all ignored the couple of organisations at mastering because there weren't enough of them. So we've just focused on these 3 middle stages, and we're focusing here on service delivery, so the influence of data and analytics on service delivery, and we are focusing on some aspects of that are part of the assessment. So we're looking at the influence of data on evidencing needs, evidencing impact, the design and delivery of services, reach and engagement with clients, how services are targeted, and also into client, or if you're an environmental charity, environmental outcomes. We also just wanted to hone in on where organisations said that they were working moderately or extensively. What we found for emerging organisations is typically their staff time working with data was 43%. And in terms of benefits and rewards, they were pretty poor. I mean, only 3 areas showed any evidence, and here only moderate, and only for a very small proportion of organisations, that their main area of improvement of benefit and influence of data was around evidencing needs and problems that the organisation seeks to address. There's a little bit in evidencing impact to stakeholders, and even less around the design and delivery of services. So we then decided to look at the next stage. And what we found is, bing bong, 53% of time was spent working with data. So it's not true that it requires less effort, for sure. These learning organisations, however, for that extra effort, are seeing rewards in many, many more areas than those at the emerging stage. You can see not only are they evidencing needs, and they're much stronger around evidencing that impact to their stakeholders, and also probably in the forefront with that is the design and delivery of services. But they're really picking up on things like client outcomes and targeting of services and their reach. And then when we move to the developing organisations, it increased again to 60%, and those were seeing even greater, far more extensive rewards and benefits across all of those kind of service areas. So the truth is, I would like to say that if you get better with data, it's just going to be no trouble at all. But that is really not true. It's going to take a lot of time and effort from people, but the rewards and benefits are really worth it. And that's the sort of exciting finding, I would say, from this. Now, some of the other questions we get asked about a lot are about money. There's a sort of assumption that really big organizations with lots of resources, or with data and analytics teams and departments, are doing fantastically, and that smaller organizations are not. We have looked at this time and time again, and this year's results show no difference again, that whatever the scale and size of the organization that is exploring their data maturity, pretty well they're all in that learning stage. Even the ones we don't know the turnover for are in that learning stage. So there's no evidence that being an overall higher income organization makes you more mature. But it is about the money, because it is about investment. And what we have asked when we've looked here about whether organizations say leaders invest enough in data related resources, certainly a much smaller proportion, only about a quarter, agree on that. I mean, arguably, there's never enough resource for anything, but certainly the organizations that are more data mature are much more likely to agree that their leaders invest enough. And there's a lot of ambivalence, a good, heading for a good half, who don't think that their leaders are investing enough in the people and the skills and the learning and the tools in their organizations. So finally, insight number 7, organizations aren't taking advantage of digital tools to make data work for their cause. We found 40% are still collecting data on paper, either moderately or extensively. And to be fair, there's often good reason for that. I would say it's notable that this figure is 14% lower than it was last year. And I don't doubt that the pandemic and the rapid digitization of services may well have had an influence on that. And we're still kind of curious about the relationship between digital maturity and data maturity. I know some of my colleagues who are focused more in the digital world and I talk about this a lot, and certainly we feel they are aligned. But of course, it's very difficult to analyze and report data on paper. So it does help if it's digitized, even if it takes an arduous manual process to get it there. When it comes to the kinds of tools, I mean, obviously the sector does use lots and lots of digital tools. But focusing on the kinds of tools they're using for analysing and reporting data, you can see that spreadsheets are still the most common route across the board. I mean, nearly 85% would say that they use spreadsheets for analysing and reporting data. Meanwhile, databases and CRMs are pretty common too, heading towards around 60% are using those. And then a whole range of other tools are in there. Bottom of the list is the more specialist tools. So some of the kinds of data science type tools and the GIS mapping kind of tools are being used, but by a really small proportion. Only about 5% are saying they're using those extensively, maybe 20% included with moderate. And also things like business intelligence and dashboards, probably in use by around 30% of organizations to any considerable extent. So there's still, there are opportunities certainly for advancing and using a whole range of tools for analysing and reporting data. So that brings me really to the end of my 7 key findings. All of the results have just been published today on our website in our report, which you can download here or you can read it online. I'd like to say a big thank you to my colleagues, certainly to my colleagues Matthew Gosling, Libby Harkins and Ben Proctor, who have all been involved behind the scenes on what's been quite a massive project for us over the last months. I'd like to finish though with a call to action, because I feel there is a huge task to drive the non-profit sector and its data maturity, and I feel it's urgent. There are big and worsening problems at a global level and a local level. If anyone saw the United Nations Development Report for this year, the challenges are urgent and huge. But also there are great opportunities. There are great opportunities to be more focused, actually to be more efficient and more effective as a sector. And we need to get faster and better at reversing these trajectories of problems, preventing things happening, resolving the massive problems that we have in the world. And so my calls to action are, I suppose, to start seeing, looking at your data as an asset, which can empower organisations to influence change. I think there's a real opportunity there. Secondly, my call is to policymakers and leaders and infrastructure organisations, those who have got financial resources like grant makers who have an interest in strengthening the sector. Invest more, invest in building the knowledge and skills to advance data maturity in the sector. And finally, it's a call around education and training, really, around those sectors. There's a real need for more data learning pathways, both training people within the sector, within the not-for-profit sector, in leadership, in specialist data roles, in general data literacy and fluency. But there's also a need to bring in more young and more diverse people into the sector with those skills. So that finishes my, my manifesto for the state of data maturity in the non-profit sector for this year's report. Question time.
Okay, that was great. Thank you very much. We do have a little bit of time for questions. There is one question in the Q&A session. If you've got more questions, please do drop them in there. I'm going to use chair's prerogative and ask my own question first, though. So I'm possibly because I'm overly obsessed by culture. But what does it actually mean if culture is so strongly correlated with other things? Does it mean organizations should be focused on culture and the other things will improve, or should they focus on improving skills analysis and the culture will improve? What should we do with that finding?
Well, I think what it's saying is that the culture perhaps is the starting point and the linchpin. So if you work on culture, there's a likelihood that your scores for leadership and your, those behaviors will be influencing or influenced by leadership and data and skills. So I think, as others have said, that maybe the solution or the starting point for organizations is to not start with the tools, is perhaps what I'm saying, that by starting to explore culture first. I mean, it might be that different organizations score differently, but it would be a good place to start. The why is less clear, and I guess that's for us to all better understand.
Okay, great. There's a question which sort of follows on from that about leadership. So the question is, do you think that leadership using data to inform decision making is generational? So do younger leaders tend to use data more effectively?
I don't know is the answer to that. I think a lot of it comes down to trust in the quality of the data. I think that's a really important factor in why leaders would or perhaps would not choose to use data to influence their decisions. I mean, 1 in 10 respondents said that leaders didn't use data at all for their decision making, and I think that is a worse problem. I think maybe by asking questions about the quality of the data and seeking the right data, I think that's a real leadership challenge, is to be able to ask the right question of the data, or to shape the data in order that it gives them the answers that they need to make the decisions that they need to make.
So just to pursue that a bit more, so leaders of non-profit organizations tend to be sensible people. So what's holding them back? Is it funders? Is it the board? Is it the culture? Is it like what needs to be fixed around leaders to make it easier for them, I guess?
I think it's probably partly influenced by all of those. I would say, I think it's partly the availability of data. So it's very difficult for leaders to get the data that they need at the time they need it. And this is often an issue where organizations have lots and lots of data in many different places. And so in order for leaders to have that, in order for organizations to bring that data together and present it in ways that are useful enough to support decision making, is where there's a major problem. And this is a real issue around joining disparate data sources is really difficult. And then when they get the data, it doesn't make any sense. Maybe that, maybe they haven't asked the right question, or it's not giving them a meaningful answer to their question. And that's another conversation to have. And I think it's partly about knowing what's possible. So I think for many leaders, there's that they have a huge job to do as a leader anyway, and understanding what is possible and what they're aiming for, what the vision is for how data could support them is out of reach. And I think that's an area where we're really keen to do more work, especially with leaders.
Okay, a great question here, especially for Libby. Could it be that bias in the answers is influenced by the respondent's own cognitive styles? So are they naturally convergent or divergent in their thinking?
I think this is why I really like doing multiple assessments with organizations where they get multiple people and as many people as possible to participate, because you will have divergent opinion from people, and how one person might see the organization could be very different to another. And that's where, when we do assessments with organizations, that that gulf where there's a lot of consensus, or where people don't know how to answer things very well, or where there's a lot of consensus of opinion, are interesting aspects to delve into. And I think that's where the engaging multiple people in getting better with data is part of the conversation. It's part of the journey, is to work through that.
Okay, there's 3 more questions. So, and then I think that will be all we have time for. Oh, a 4th one has just slipped in. Maybe we'll take that. So, but pithy, we need pithy responses now.
Okay.
Not that you're not always pithy. So the first is from Kate from Superhighways. You're going to like this. So she says she understands this is a snapshot over the period where you can compare with previous years, but were you able to look at a segment where people had taken the assessment in this time frame as a repeat assessment? So do we have information on progression?
I am going to like this question. Yes. Yes, actually only about 10 in that year's data organizations were doing a repeat assessment. So arguably it's not a completely fresh set of data, because a very small number of them had actually done assessments in the previous year. We have got a whole separate research project monitoring organizations' journeys over time. And in fact, this year we've had to change our entire data model that sits behind the tool for this very reason, that organizations are taking repeat assessments. And this is what excites us most, because maybe the first assessment is a baseline, and maybe the second assessment is looking at how far they've come following some presumed implementation of change in the interim period. And we've got some exciting stories to share on that.
Okay, great. And then there's a couple about kind of more practical things. So I'm going to maybe try and take them together. So what's an easy place to start if an organization wants to improve general data skills across all of its staff? And in fact, we'll answer that one first, and we'll come back to them.
Well, to be honest, I almost feel like throwing that question straight back at you, Ben, because a good place to start would be with data basics, with which you are very familiar. Would you like to just explain a little bit?
I feel like I'm the one that is supposed to be asking the questions here, but yes, very briefly, there's a set of materials produced by a team out of MIT a few years ago now. They were designed for non-profits. You can just pick them up and use them, and they're designed to promote fluency in data across organizations. We've used them a lot. We think they're brilliant. We've helped Data Cymru produce a bilingual version for Wales. So that's definitely the place I would start. Contact me if you want me to go on about it some more. We're very nearly out of time. So last 2 questions. Most people seem to say they don't improve their data processes because they don't have the time and have more urgent things to prioritize, such as running their services or fundraising. What do you think is the best response to that?
Oh, I totally agree with that challenge. I run a really small business, and it's an endless tally of juggle of priorities. I think this is why the moving the prioritization into plan and focusing on what are the things that you must do, and just setting yourselves some targets for the next year is what I would recommend, and aim for the ones that are most important for your organization. Many organizations might choose to focus on getting their data secure, putting it in the cloud might be, and those are big jobs. So I think developing some kind of strategy around what's most important and prioritizing those. And maybe you need to bring in external resources to support you, or to get the capacity in order for you to invest. And indeed, programs like DataWise are a good place to start as well, in terms of resources and training.
Okay, that's great. There's lots of stuff going on in the chat, which we don't have time to bring in, but is great. So thank you for that. And then the final question is a nice big picture question to end on. Has the political landscape affected our trust in evidence and data decisions?
Well, I suppose perhaps from a public point of view, I know this is a big issue about lack of trust in institutions and in politics and political systems. I think certainly the sector as a whole has a challenge in having trust from the public. One of the biggest benefits of data mature organizations that I see is an increase in their credibility and influence. And one of the things that excites me most about the sector is how collaborative it is becoming in terms of data sharing. And so increasingly we're seeing shared measures and benchmarks, not just within the sector, but linked to national data like health and well-being, data from the ONS. I think there's a lot of very robust evidence on the quality of that data and how well people can trust it. And I encourage any organisation to be open about their processes around how they collect data and how accurate or representative they are. So I suppose my general feeling is that it feels more and more exciting. And I think there are lots of, even in subsectors like housing or homelessness or in youth, there are, you know, in domestic violence, there are like big projects that involve lots of organizations who are looking at data in the contexts where they work. And I think by that openness and that collaboration will drive up more trust and will drive up better practices.
Okay. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Obviously, thank you, Sian, most of all, but thank everybody who attended, asked questions, took part in the chat, or just sat and listened. It was great to see you here. Just some quick bits of housekeeping. So the report is out on that link. Please do read it, share it with other people. We run other events. We've got a workshop coming up on data culture next month, and after that on tools. So that's quite topical. We're also running some webinars on a very niche subject about mapping and the Welsh language. Please join our mailing list, join our community on Slack, check out lots of resources on data maturity. Thanks very much. It was great to have you here.